Welcome to the Register's Report. My name is John Buckley. I'm the Register of Deeds of Plymouth County. This show is about Plymouth County real estate. Our headline for the month was Fiscal Year Comes to an End with a Mortgage Surge. This show is being taped in July, but we're reporting on June activity at the Registry of Deeds. There'll be a number of charts you're going to see. My next segment, we have Tim White, the Assistant Registrar of Deeds, talking about our colonial records, and then we'll get into some more Plymouth County and colony history. So as far as sales of property for the month of June, it was a very busy month. There were 1,107 deeds in June, more than the 945 in May, a little less than last year's 1,295. For the first 6 months of calendar year 19, we're down 8% in sales. You're going to see a listing of sales by each of our 27 communities. Plymouth being the highest number of sales, Brockton being second. Now you're going to see a listing of mortgages. You can see that there was a surge in mortgages in June. 2,062 mortgages recorded in June, more than the 1,976 in May, up 7% compared to last June, and pretty much even with last year. We've always followed the foreclosure issues in Plymouth County, particularly since the crisis in 2008. They're significantly down over the years, and even more significantly down in 2019. Only 29 foreclosure deeds in June, more than the 9 in May, but 57% less than last June and 53% lower than last year. A foreclosure deed is when a lender has taken back property from someone, usually for non-payment. Next, you're going to see a listing of foreclosure notices. A foreclosure notice is basically the first document we see when someone's facing financial difficulty. Those are been way down over the years. Only 66 notices in June, less than the 97 in May. Those are down 26% for the first 6 months. And you're going to see a listing after that of foreclosure deeds and foreclosure notices by each of the 27 communities in Plymouth County. Brockton has been the highest number of foreclosure deeds and orders of notice, Plymouth being second in the county. I always want to remind people we now do electronic recording of documents over the internet in land court. We've done that in the recorded side for over 10 years. Our next training room session is in August. We run a free online training session the first Thursday of every month. In August actually is August 8th at 9 o'clock. If you'd like to sign up for that, please call our office. There are 8 hands-on stations, and you'll learn a lot about how to navigate the search system and learn a lot of tricks about that. We expect to soon be releasing the first phase of our transcriptions. Basically, you'll see the original handwriting from 1686 forward, and you'll be able to hit a button to the right of it, and up will pop a transcription. It's a great service. Certainly, many people are coming along in the school systems. They're not being taught cursive, so it's a great thing for the future. I have a great guest coming up in segment 2. Tim White, the Assistant Registrar of Deeds, is going to be talking about some Registry of Deeds projects and something about our colonial records. So we'll see you next segment. Welcome back to the Register's Report. My name is John Buckley. I'm the Register of Deeds of Plymouth County. In this segment of the show, we always try to do something educational in nature. We've had many people involved in the real estate community, surveyors, assessors, appraisers, commercial real estate brokers, and of course a lot of realtors talking about what is going on in the Plymouth County real estate community. I have a great guest on this show. He's a repeat guest. my Assistant Register of Deeds, Tim White. Welcome back, Tim.
Thanks, John. Great to be here.
So usually we talk about some of our ongoing technology projects.
Right.
And I will mention that we're getting very close to the release of some of our transcriptions.
Yes.
The ability to go back and see the old handwriting side or in line with a transcribed version of it,
Right.
back to 1686
Yep.
and forward. And some other technology changes were made. But today we wanted to do something a little lighter in nature than that and get into some of our great Plymouth Colony history. We're coming up on about 5 months to go before January 1st of 2020. And as I mentioned on the show before, many people will know that we have in our building in Plymouth at 50 Aubrey Street, the Plymouth Colony records. And I know you've become a real adept and a real great producer of some of these stories of the colonial records. So I thought we'd get into some of those.
Happy to, John. And I would qualify that as an amateur historian. But just to go back is...
Compared to the people that we see all the time.
I mean, given that we're coming up on the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower, it's been quite exciting for us to be able to dig into those records. And some of the discoveries we make of the different types of records that they have really give us great insight on how the Pilgrims lived back in the 1600s, and how they set up their own laws, their own community, how they developed their roads, their transportation, their infrastructure, and how they dealt, obviously, with the Native Americans. So it's, we're talking about celebrating the 400th year of the arrival of the Mayflower. There are records in there that actually talk about the Mayflower. Right. I mean, so it's great.
Yeah, I know you've had a lot of fun digging through them, and
yep.
We've had a lot of historians visit our reading room and come mostly specifically for a particular piece of something that they're researching, and you've been a great part of that.
Yeah, I mean, historians, educators,
Sure.
teachers. We had a group in yesterday of about a dozen folks that almost like a tour group,
Right.
And it was fabulous. It's great because they clearly appreciate it. The group we had yesterday had 2 teachers, and they couldn't wait to get back to school in September to share what they saw yesterday in Plymouth.
That's great.
Yeah.
So I know once a month as part of our social media things, the radio show, the 2 cable shows we do, we share one of them. But I know that over time, and I will be doing one of them as we get into my next segment, but over time you've developed quite a list of them. Do you want to take a run through some of the ones you
Sure,
found
I'd be happy
interesting?
to, yeah. I mean,
Let's take a walk through that.
yeah, I mean, for example, yesterday with the group, I pulled out 3 of our colonial record books, and the one that is so much Plymouth is the first deed in our country. Even though Jamestown was discovered earlier than Plymouth, Jamestown didn't preserve any records relating to real estate. So we have the oldest records relating to real estate in our country.
An organized record system.
Correct.
Recording system
Right.
for land records.
Right. And so that first deed, which is book 1, page 1 of the deeds colonial record, gives us the layout of Leiden Street. And Leiden Street is in downtown Plymouth, right, and still an active street in the 21st century. It's crazy.
The fact that it was in the handwriting of the second colonial governor, William Bradford.
William Bradford is
makes it even
better.
More
It really does. And only one side of the street is developed,
right,
and they call it the street,
right,
and it's crossing Court Street, which they call the highway. So it's that was one example, and my favorite, and I think probably one of your favorites, John, is the first law that was passed in our country that required the right to trial by jury.
Right.
And it's actually a record that the transcription is included in our court system's website.
On juries.
on
yeah.
jurors. And, but the one thing that transcriptions don't tell you is that in the original document where it says that you have a right to trial by jury by 12 honest men, is it actually first said 12 men, and the colonists sitting around the room crossed out men and then wrote in honest men.
And you can see the markup.
You
of
can
that.
actually see honest men being crossed over and then rewritten, and it literally transports you back to the 1600s into that room with them as they have this conversation as to how they should draft that right to trial by jury.
And I thought it fascinating when we had the Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Court, Justice Gantz, came down on a visit to Plymouth, and he walked over and saw that, and even someone of his stature was totally impressed.
He was mesmerized, I think is the right word for it. He was just, you could just see his heart stopped for a minute when he actually saw it. So, but we have so many of those, and we have records relating to the construction of early prisons, of roadways, of bridges, authorizing the first ferry and get paid a penny to transport folks across the Jones River. But I got to say, one of the favorites that I have is, we call it the cow mortgage. And that's where a gentleman borrowed money from another colonist, and as security, he gave him his brown cow as a mortgage. And it turns out it wasn't the first time that he had borrowed money off this feller. He had actually used that cow as security on an earlier occasion. So we like to call it the used cow loan instead of used car loan. But again, just that's an example of how you learn about how they lived back then. I mean, yes, they did have pounds and sterling and pence and things of that nature, but a lot of the business transactions were bartered.
In some of the communities in what was then known as Plymouth Colony are in those records also.
Absolutely. The founding of Marshfield, founding of Duxbury, the founding of Scituate.
Wasn't Dartmouth one of them?
Dartmouth is one of them. Taunton, when they actually named it Taunton, and I forget what the prior name was, a Native American name. Middleborough the same way. Middleborough had a prior name to it as well. And Middleborough is just celebrating their 350th, I believe, and we were able to pull the actual founding of Middleborough record out for them and share it with them. So it's those kinds of things that really, it is absolutely the most fun part of this job. It's just fabulous.
And I know you've been a great host when visiting professors have come. We had a professor from Yale, I believe, and from Brown.
From Brown
recently.
as well, yep.
And some authors.
And we've had authors in there. We've also had folks from historical commissions come down. So the word's getting out that we have this treasure, and I'm happy it is. I think it's a great opportunity in 2020 to share these records with America.
So you want to go through some other ones?
Sure, yeah. A lot of folks in Plymouth are familiar with the Jenny Grist Mill. And we have the authorization that the colonial government gave to John Jenny to open up the grist mill. But we have another record that came in a few years later where Mr. Jenny was fined for poor grinding. So again, it tells you how life is, you know. They give them the grant to set up the grist mill, and then someone's not happy with it, and they actually fine them for not providing a good service. They have one of the first examples of veterans benefits in our country, where the court ordered that any soldier who served the colony, who was wounded or injured, would be taken care of by the colony for the remainder of his life. They had a draft, Homeland Security. They had to be prepared for attacks by the local natives or by pirates, for that matter. So there was a draft, and everybody was required to participate in, all the young men. What else? The Treasury records, which the Treasury records are basically their accounts, and they tell you what each community was assessed You know, we assess taxes now to different individuals as well. It tells you how each free man was taxed. And the cream of the crop was taxed more than folks that might not have been quite as well off. So it was somewhat of a graduated system, tax system back then. But they also have another interesting component to the Treasury records, and that is that they record the fines of the courts. So for each month, the court would fine certain folks for offenses that they have performed. And some of them, again, give you a wonderful insight as to how they lived back then. One fellow was fined for sailing to Yarmouth from Plymouth on the Sabbath. You know, I mean, we all go out for a Sunday sail these days. Well, back then, that was a no-no because it was such a puritanical society. And we think about the Pilgrims came over specifically for religious freedom. And that did apply to them, but not so much for Quakers. If you were caught consorting with a Quaker, you could be fined. If you went to a Quaker's meeting, you could actually be whipped or put in the stocks. And speaking of that, there's the story of a young couple that had been recently married and had a child apparently within 9 months. And so the court decided that they had been having relations outside of marriage, and the husband was whipped and the wife was put in the stocks. Even though they got married and the child was born after they were married, it was, again, a different society back then.
And wasn't there one similar to the Scarlet Letter?
That's a good point, John. There are actually a couple of scarlet letters that I came across back then. That we do have the one for the adulteress. And what they actually did is they required them to wear a knitted A, actually I think it was AD, for adulteress on their chest. And if they were caught without it, then they would receive additional whippings or time in the stocks. But there's a second scarlet letter, and that was the F. And the F was if you were caught forging a document, which tells you that, you know, back then, the transactions were primarily real estate related. And if you were fooling around with someone's deed and you know, faking their name and transferring the property,
Or signing agreements.
signing agreements, then you would be given that scarlet letter of F along with some additional punishment, likely whipping and or the stocks.
And there was one, I think it was a while ago, related to a native that was murdered by a colonist.
One of the earliest death penalty cases, and it actually was, you know, there's been so much conversation over the more recent years about the mistreatment of the Native Americans by the Pilgrims. But in this particular case, the Pilgrims made sure that the colonist who committed the murder was charged and ultimately hung for murdering a Native American. But we have things in there on treaties, Massasoit's name in there, all the, you know, Miles Standish's will. One of the favorite, you know, Miles Standish's will was fairly typical for that time. It was a patriarchal society. The oldest son got the best out of the estate, and the rest of the children were all taken care of, very family-oriented, but he also made sure that his indentured servant, a fellow by the name of John Irish, and I don't know for certain, but I'd be willing to bet that his name was John O'Flaherty or John Buckley or something like that, and that they called him John Irish because he came from Ireland. But he was, Standish said, if you finish your service, which you might have 2 more years after I die, and you provide that service to my widow, then I leave you a small part of my estate. So again, it gets into the indentured servant, another part of what life was back then. So many of the folks came over here as indentured servants because they couldn't afford the fare to come over. And they couldn't, once they got here, they didn't have anything to provide for themselves. So this was a way for them to come to America.
Well, I know that people find this information fascinating, and I will share with our viewers that we're looking to change over a current display we have at the registry, which is Settlements of Plymouth County, into a Settlements or something about Plymouth Colony.
Colony, right.
You know, notable records of Plymouth Colony.
Which includes towns that are in Barnstable,
Sure.
that are towns that are in Bristol County.
Right.
Actually, probably Rhode Island as well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
all the way
Yeah.
over to Tiverton.
Yep.
So it's fascinating stuff. I know you've enjoyed it. I know that people that come in and visit the reading room, it actually is a construction of a temperature and humidity controlled vault that we store the records in, very secure and alarmed with cameras and everything. And we have beside it a reading room where we can work with visitors to let them see the records in a way that is, again, secure, but a way they can see the primary source, which is the original records.
I think an interesting thing to say about the original records too, John, is that for many, many years, these records were kept by the registers of deeds, as the keepers of the records, and they were kept in their homes. So clearly no temperature control, no humidity control, nothing. And back in the early 1800s, in 1819 or 1820, the Commonwealth recognized that these documents were starting to disintegrate, and some worse than others, but they decided that the legislature, to its credit, decided they had to do something about it. And they hired a company down in either Taunton or New Bedford to preserve the records. And what they did is they took these original records of parchment and they interwove them into a larger sheet of paper and put them into a
Some
book.
kind of a pressing.
Pressing, so much so that you can't tell where the original record ends and the preserving paper begins. And you know, we sometimes we make the legislature, oh, they don't do anything, they don't do anything right. Well, they did this right, and they should be accommodated for it.
Well, I appreciate you coming on.
It's great to be here.
And I know that if people look every month at our newsletters that we put out, which are always online, we'll always have one of those colonial records recognized in that newsletter. On these cable shows, as people will see in the next segment, we talk about some of our other history, and then we always end it with one of our colonial records, including today's, which is a gatehouse.
Right, which is also the original record of in the original colonist handwriting with the transcription, so that you can understand what they're saying. But even the transcription sometimes is hard to understand.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Well, great. Well, thanks for coming.
Thank you so
As
much.
always, did a good job. Welcome back to the Register's Report. Again, my name is John Buckley. I'm the Register of Deeds of Plymouth County. I want to thank Tim White for the great job he did in describing how we share the colonial records with the public and professionals that have come into our office. We're trying to develop a display that'll be upcoming in 2020 rather. In this segment of this show, we talk about some of our great collections that we have at the registry related to Plymouth County history. The holidays in July were Independence Day in the 4th, Bastille Day in the 14th, National Hot Dog Day in the 17th, and National Ice Cream Day on the 21st. And now we're going to go right to a couple of our Plymouth County notable records from our notable records collection, and we're going to talk about lighthouses. So Hannah Thomas was America's first female lighthouse keeper. She was a lighthouse keeper out at Gurnett Point, the entranceway to Plymouth Harbor. It was authorized by the Massachusetts legislature in 1768. The first lighthouse was a wooden lighthouse. It was actually a twin towers, and the lighthouse was built on the land of John and Hannah Thomas. When John Thomas went off to fight in the Revolutionary War and was killed, Hannah Thomas was named America's first female lighthouse keeper. And during the Revolutionary War, the towns of Plymouth, Duxbury, and Kingston erected a fort on the Gurnett. And in 1802, Hannah and her son John sold the lighthouse to the United States government. It is currently cared by Project Gurnet and Bug Light Incorporated. Next one you're going to see is another lighthouse in the town of Scituate, a very famous lighthouse. It was known as the location of the Army of Two. United States government opened a lighthouse on Cedar Point in Scituate basically in 1811. In 1814, Simeon Bates was away, and he left his daughters Rebecca and Abigail in charge. And when they were in charge, they saw off the coast of Scituate some barges filled with British soldiers trying to enter Scituate Harbor. They gathered some townspeople, got a fife and drum, and made a lot of noise so that the arriving British people would know that, soldiers would know that there were people there waiting for them. They were scared off, and they had been trying to sack the town, but they were chased away. And that is the legend of the American Army of Two. Scituate Lighthouse is now owned by the town of Scituate, and over the years there have been reports of the sound of the fife and drum mixing in with the sound of the waves crashing on the jetties leaving into Scituate Harbor. Quite a story. And the next one we're going to talk about is Miners Ledge Light. Again, it's off of Scituate. It was constructed in 1860, 1 mile offshore. After the first lighthouse was washed away, a second one was built, and it still stands today. Because there were many shipwrecks out there, they emphasized the need of this lighthouse. And basically, on May of 1894, a flashing light was installed to warn these ships. And it was the same numerical count, word spelling-wise, as I love you light. So 143 is the flash, and it became known as Lover's Light. It's built on Miners Ledge. It's 114 feet tall. It is currently owned privately. It was sold by the United States government in 2014. And interestingly, from the registry's perspective, there was no land reference at the time because nobody else had owned it privately, so they used GPS coordinates to include it in the deed. And last but not least for our records is one of our colonial records, and it's the decision by the colonial court to establish toll gates. And they were charging people to go through these gates as they traveled around the roads. They were built for both security and for payment of building of the roads. And it was George Pollard that made the gates and was able to collect the money for doing it. So I want to thank the folks here at PAC TV for their help doing this show. It allows us to share with people what for most people is their most valuable asset, their real estate. I want to thank Lorna Green Baker, Christine Richards from our office in helping me put this show together. David Antoine and Ben Alexander have been great at putting this together with me over the years. And today I had some great help from Mark McKinley and Keith Hughes. So thank you for watching this show. I'll see you next month. Have a great rest of July.